Welcome to our channel, where we uncover the darkest truths lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Tonight, we delve into a true story that will challenge your perception of safety and make you look at strangers in a new, terrifying light. It's a case that reveals how a quiet, unassuming man hid a chilling obsession, turning the lives of hundreds of women into a 6-year nightmare of fear and violation. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the criminal mind. Now, let's open the file on the case of the Phantom Stalker. Eleanor Vance had always been the heart of her family, a beacon of warmth and affection in a household that thrived on her presence. She moved through life with grace, her laughter like sunlight streaming through the windows of the Vance estate, her kindness touching every corner of their suburban neighborhood. Neighbors admired her generosity, friends sought her counsel, and family members leaned on her unwavering support. She was the matriarch, the glue that held them together, the gentle force whose presence seemed inseparable from the rhythms of their lives. Yet, in a single unfathomable morning, Eleanor was gone. The news came like a thunderclap. She had passed away suddenly, the official cause listed as a heart attack. The doctor spoke in clinical terms, explaining the fragility of the human heart, the unforeseen nature of sudden cardiac events, and the statistics that made the world seem like a place where such tragedies were inevitable. To most, it was a heartbreaking but natural occurrence. To them, Eleanor's absence left a palpable void. Her bedroom remained untouched, her favorite teacup sat idle on the kitchen counter, and the air seemed heavier with the absence of her voice. But for Clara Vance, Eleanor's young granddaughter, the notion that her grandmother's death was a mere accident could not settle within her chest. From the moment she had heard the news, a gnawing suspicion had taken root, persistent and unyielding. Something about the timing, the atmosphere in the household, the subtle behaviors she observed, all hinted at a story untold. Clara had always been perceptive, attentive to the smallest details others might overlook: a flicker of a glance, a tone of voice, a hesitation in speech. And in Julian Vance, Eleanor's trusted nephew and close family confidant, she found an anomaly too striking to ignore. Julian had been omnipresent during the days surrounding Eleanor's passing. He arrived at the estate before the paramedics had even left, speaking in hushed, composed tones to the doctors and nurses, offering condolences with impeccable etiquette, his face etched with the kind of grief that appeared rehearsed. Clara, however, noticed the small inconsistencies. A tremor in his hand when he thought no one was watching, a momentary glint in his eyes that did not belong to sorrow, and an almost imperceptible satisfaction that he attempted and failed to mask beneath the veneer of grief. The first night after Eleanor's death, Clara found herself wandering the halls of the Grand Vance estate, unable to sleep. The moonlight poured through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden floors, the portraits of ancestors, and the quiet solemnity of a house in mourning. Each room held memories. Each object whispered fragments of the life Eleanor had led. Clara stopped in front of a painting of her grandmother as a young woman, sunlight glinting off the frame, and felt a pang that transcended sadness. It was a recognition of a bond severed too soon, a connection lost in the silent spaces left behind. Her thoughts inevitably drifted to Julian. He had been close to Eleanor, her loyal nephew, the one who always visited without fail, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who had seemed a steady presence throughout her life. Yet now, with Eleanor gone, there was an uncanny precision in his movements. He organized the funeral arrangements with meticulous efficiency, selecting flowers, scheduling the service, and coordinating with distant relatives as though he were choreographing a performance. His grief appeared exactly as expected, his tears falling in measured intervals, his hands clasped over the podium as he delivered eulogies that were heartfelt yet oddly devoid of genuine warmth. Clara's unease deepened during the funeral itself. She watched Julian from a distance, noting how he lingered near the casket, his eyes scanning the faces of family and friends, as if measuring reactions, testing boundaries, or even claiming dominion over the narrative of Eleanor's passing. When he spoke to neighbors or distant cousins, his voice carried a charm and sincerity that seemed effortless, yet every word was weighed, calculated, deliberate. To an outsider, He appeared the epitome of compassion. To Clara, he seemed something else entirely, a figure whose intentions were obscured behind a mask perfected over years of practice. In the days that followed, Clara began to notice more subtle anomalies. Letters that had been left in Eleanor's study, once carefully organized, were rearranged. Personal items, previously stored with precision, had been touched or relocated. Certain family heirlooms, which Eleanor had never permitted to be moved without her consent, were now out of place, their positions suggesting intention rather than accident. Julian was always nearby, always attentive, always offering help. Yet his presence brought with it a quiet tension, an unspoken assertion of control over a household still reeling from loss. Driven by instinct and an inescapable sense of suspicion, Clara decided to investigate. She began cataloging inconsistencies. The times Julian appeared unexpectedly, the discrepancies in his recounting of events, and the unusual attention he paid to certain documents and personal effects that had belonged solely to Eleanor. She realized that his grief was performative, that his sorrow had contours shaped by careful thought rather than raw emotion. With every passing day, the pieces of an invisible puzzle began to align, forming a pattern that suggested the possibility of a truth far darker than a natural death. One afternoon, Clara returned to Eleanor's study, a room filled with the warmth of memory bookshelves lined with volumes on gardening, cooking, family history, and philosophy. Photographs of vacations and family gatherings, and the small, delicate trinkets that Eleanor had collected over a lifetime. As she sifted through papers, she discovered a set of letters Julian had been overseeing, correspondence that did not match Eleanor's handwriting, containing subtle alterations, corrections, and insertions that hinted at manipulation. Each line, each phrase seemed carefully constructed, designed to redirect attention, to obscure certain facts, to conceal elements of a narrative that Clara was only beginning to perceive. The shadows lengthened outside the study window as Clara pieced together the implications of what she had found. Julian's proximity, his meticulous attention, his oddly timed interventions each now took on a new significance. The more she examined, the more she realized that she could not ignore the possibility. Eleanor's death, so neatly categorized by medical professionals as natural, might have been orchestrated, her life cut short not by chance, but by design. Sleep became increasingly elusive for Clara. Nights were punctuated by dreams in which Julian loomed large, his figure morphing between the familiar and the sinister, always present, always observing, always calculating. Every sound in the Housia creaking floorboard, the rustle of paper, the click of a door set her nerves on edge. Her mind, once attuned to the subtle rhythms of family life, now scanned for anomalies, for signs, for the faintest indication of betrayal. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara began documenting everything. Conversations, discrepancies, movements, and expressions. She knew she needed evidence, concrete proof that could withstand scrutiny. The stakes were enormous. Julian was a respected figure in the family and in the community, a man whose charm and perceived reliability had shielded him from suspicion. To accuse him without undeniable proof would risk ridicule, ostracism, and the collapse of her own credibility. Yet Clara's instincts, honed by years of observing human behavior and reading between the lines of interaction, screamed that inaction was far more dangerous than confrontation. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled over the hills surrounding the Vance estate, Clara ventured into the section of Eleanor's study that Julian rarely entered, the private cabinet that held her grandmother's personal journals and letters. With trembling hands, she unlocked the cabinet, revealing a stack of carefully preserved notebooks. Flipping through the pages, she discovered Eleanor's meticulous accounts of her health, her daily routines, and her interactions with family members. Every entry painted a picture of a vibrant woman, attentive to her body and conscious of her well-being. There was no indication of underlying illness that could have precipitated a sudden heart attack. Clara's heart pounded as realization dawned. The medical explanation, while comforting in its simplicity, failed to account for the subtle anomalies she had been documenting. Julian's omnipresence, his precise grief, the inconsistencies in letters and personal items all suggested that Eleanor's death had been more than just unfortunate. Clara understood that confronting Julian directly, without irrefutable evidence, could be perilous. He was clever, composed, and accustomed to controlling narratives, and she could not underestimate the lengths he might go to protect his carefully maintained facade. The chapter closed with Clara resolved to pursue the truth, her grief interwoven with determination. The idyllic family life she had known was irrevocably altered, the image of the beloved matriarch forever tarnished by doubt and suspicion. Yet, amid the shadows of fear and uncertainty, a spark of courage ignited. She would uncover the secrets Julian had so carefully buried, no matter the cost. The story of Eleanor Vance's sudden departure had only just begun, and Clara knew that what lay ahead would challenge everything she thought she knew about trust, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the most familiar faces. Clara's heart had not yet healed from the loss of her grandmother Eleanor, but the gnawing suspicion that had taken root in the aftermath of Eleanor's sudden death would not allow her peace. Each night, the darkness of her room seemed heavier, filled not with the silence of sleep but with the whispers of doubt. Julian's presence during the funeral had been too precise, his gestures too controlled, his sorrow too calculated. The perfect grief of a devoted nephew or the cunning mask of a predator? Clara could no longer ignore the question that haunted her every waking thought. She had to know the truth. The first step was to enlist help she could trust. Old Mrs. Harrington, a close friend of Eleanor's, had always been known as the sharpest mind in the neighborhood, a retired private investigator whose keen intuition had solved cases long before the police even arrived. Clara reached out, her voice trembling as she recounted the anomalies she had observed, the inconsistencies in Julian's behavior, and the lingering unease she could not explain. Mrs. Harrington listened carefully, her eyes narrowing, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the phone receiver. "I've seen this before, Clara," she said finally. "Sometimes the danger closest to us wears a familiar face. Sometimes it is the people we trust the most who hide the darkest secrets. If you want answers, I can dig into Julian's past. But you have to understand, once we start, there's no turning back. You may not like what we find." Clara agreed without hesitation. The next morning, a discreet investigation began. Background checks, financial records, and historical employment documents were pulled. The deeper Mrs. Harrington dug, the darker the picture became. Julian Vance, the amiable and devoted nephew, was not the man everyone believed him to be. He had a history riddled with financial scandals and lawsuits, numerous accusations of fraud, and a life built on deception and false appearances. It appeared he had manipulated hundreds of people, gaining trust only to exploit them for financial gain, living in luxury while leaving a trail of victims behind. Clara's stomach turned as she read the reports. How could someone so close, so entwined with her beloved grandmother, harbor such a history? The realization was almost unbearable. But the most alarming discoveries lay not in his financial exploits, but in the remnants of a medical career she had never known. Julian had once been a licensed physician, a man trusted with lives and sworn to heal. Yet records revealed that his license had been revoked following an investigation into improper drug administration. The details were scarce, obscured by legal jargon, but the message was clear. Julian had once held power over life and death, and had misused it. Clara's mind raced. Could it be possible that Julian had used his medical knowledge against Eleanor? The thought seemed impossible, abhorrent even. Yet the growing pile of evidence gnawed at her resolve. She had to be certain before confronting him. Her next step was to investigate Eleanor's personal notes. She returned to the study, cautiously opening drawers and cabinets, careful not to disturb anything that could be noticed later. There, hidden beneath a stack of letters, she found a small leather-bound journal, Eleanor's private diary, preserved with the meticulous care that had always characterized her grandmother. Opening the journal, Clara was immediately struck by the clarity of Eleanor's writing, the grace of her observations, and the warmth that radiated from every line. But soon, her attention was drawn to passages that betrayed unease. Eleanor had written about feeling unwell, experiencing fatigue and dizziness that seemed uncharacteristic of her usual vitality. The entries were measured, almost clinical yet tinged with anxiety. And then one entry, written just days before her death, made Clara's blood run cold. It mentioned Julian, who had reassured her that her symptoms were simply a result of aging, and that there was no cause for concern. But Clara knew better. She had witnessed Eleanor's sharp mind and attention to detail. She knew that a woman of her vitality would not simply dismiss these warning signs. Julian's reassurances, once taken at face value, now carried a sinister weight. He had lied, deliberately, masking the truth behind a veneer of concern. The seeds of doubt Clara had nurtured since Eleanor's death had grown into a forest of suspicion, and she could no longer ignore the possibility that her grandmother's death was not natural at all. With renewed determination, Clara began to research the types of medications Julian could have had access to during his time as a doctor. She reviewed pharmaceutical records, studied the effects of various sedatives, and even contacted old colleagues of Julian under the guise of a student doing research on medical malpractice. Every thread she pulled seemed to weave a larger tapestry of horror. Julian had both the knowledge and the opportunity to administer substances that could simulate a natural heart failure, all while maintaining the appearance of caring for his patient. Night after night, Clara pored over Eleanor's diary, cross-referencing entries with financial records and Julian's schedule. The pattern was chilling. Every day that Eleanor had complained of discomfort, Julian had been present, offering solace, watching, noting, intervening. The coincidences were too precise, the alignment too perfect to be accidental. Each observation, each detail, reinforced a creeping conclusion. Eleanor's death had been orchestrated, not merely allowed to happen. The investigation began to take a personal toll. Clara's days became consumed with research, surveillance, and analysis. She hardly slept, and the walls of the Vance estate began to feel claustrophobic. The once comforting space now seemed suffocating, filled with echoes of Julian's duplicity. Even the smallest sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of an air conditioner, set her nerves on edge. Every glance over her shoulder, every shadow in the corner of her eye, suggested the omnipresence of someone who was always watching, always waiting, always calculating. Clara's meticulous work eventually yielded a breakthrough. She discovered hidden correspondences between Julian and certain pharmacies, where records of rare compound sedatives and cardiac-affecting substances were linked to prescriptions written in Eleanor's name. The dates aligned perfectly with the diary entries documenting her sudden bouts of illness. The realization was unbearable. Julian had not only manipulated her grandmother's perception of her own health, but had actively controlled it, administering substances that may have contributed directly to her death. With this evidence, Clara faced a difficult choice: confront Julian alone, or bring the authorities into a web so intricate and dangerous that any misstep could destroy her credibility, or worse, put her in harm's way. She decided on caution. She arranged a meeting with Detective Harris, a trusted officer who had worked with her family for years. She presented her findings: the diary, the medical anomalies, the financial and pharmaceutical records. Detective Harris's expression shifted from polite interest to grim realization as he absorbed the implications. This is serious," he muttered. "If your suspicions are correct, Julian Vance isn't just a fraud. He's a murderer." The weight of the words settled on Clara like a stone. She had feared this conclusion, had tried to push it away, but now the undeniable truth demanded action. Together, she and Detective Harris began to formulate a plan to bring Julian into the light, gather indisputable proof, protect herself, and ensure that justice would be served. Meanwhile, Julian continued to move through the Vance estate with the same deceptive ease. He remained the devoted nephew, the trusted confidant, and the comforting presence to friends and neighbors. But Clara's quiet investigation had begun to weave a web that he could not anticipate. Each night, she documented his movements, cross-checked his alibis, and compiled evidence in a secure location. The battle for the truth had begun, a delicate and dangerous game in which knowledge itself was both weapon and shield. The chapter closed with Clara standing in Eleanor's study one last time, her hands gripping the leather-bound diary as if it were a talisman. The room was silent, yet the air was thick with anticipation. She understood now that the path ahead would be perilous, that Julian was cunning and capable, and that revealing him would not be simple. But the love she bore for her grandmother, the need for justice, and the unshakable sense of moral duty had ignited a fire within her. She would not rest until the full truth about Julian Vance and Eleanor's death was exposed. The summer sun streamed through the windows of Clara's apartment, but there was no warmth in her heart. The diary of her grandmother Eleanor lay open on the kitchen table, its pages stained with both time and tears, and the words she had read over and over haunted her relentlessly. She had thought she understood the depth of Julian's deceit, but with every new discovery, the scope of his manipulation seemed to expand, growing darker, more horrifying, more impossible to comprehend. Working late into the night with Mrs. Harrington, Clara began analyzing Julian's professional history, looking for any clues that could explain how a man so trusted, so intimately involved with her grandmother, could have orchestrated her death. Their research uncovered the terrifying possibility of a rare, potent drug that could induce symptoms indistinguishable from a heart attack. It was not common, not easily accessible, and certainly not something a layperson could acquire without knowledge or connections in the medical field. "The drug, Clara," Mrs. Harrington whispered, her finger tracing the page of an old pharmaceutical catalog. "It's precise, calculated. If used correctly, it mimics a heart attack almost perfectly. And Julian, he knows how to use it. That's not an accident. That's murder disguised as misfortune." The realization made Clara's skin crawl. Every smile Julian had flashed, every comforting word he had spoken while Eleanor was unwell, now seemed like a carefully rehearsed performance. Her grandmother's trust, the trust of her family, had been weaponized against them. Clara felt bile rise in her throat. She thought of the delicate hand-carved objects Eleanor treasured, the gentle laughter in the sunlit garden, the warmth of her grandmother's embrace, all manipulated, all used to lull suspicion while Julian acted with surgical precision. Determined to confront him, Clara arranged a meeting. She met Julian in the same room where her grandmother had once hosted tea for close relatives, a room now steeped in bitter irony. Julian greeted her with the same charm, the same practiced warmth that had disarmed everyone before her. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice honeyed, "you're worried for nothing. Your grandmother loved me. She knew I cared." But Clara's eyes were sharper now. She presented her evidence cautiously, speaking of the rare drug, of Eleanor's symptoms, of the meticulous record-keeping she had discovered. Julian listened, nodding slowly, tilting his head, his expression a mixture of mild concern and feigned incredulity. "Clara, you're imagining things," he said softly. "Eleanor's health was fragile. She knew the risks. I cared for her as any loving relative would." The words were smooth, persuasive, suffused with the same confidence that had made him so dangerous for years. Clara wanted to believe them, wanted to convince herself that perhaps she had been wrong, that her suspicions were simply grief twisting her perception. And for a moment she almost did. But the tiny, nagging inconsistencies, the timing of the pharmacy records, the way Julian had always been present at Eleanor's most vulnerable moments, the alignment of his movements with her grandmother's declining health kept her doubts alive. Julian left that meeting smiling, leaving Clara unsettled, frustrated, and more determined than ever. If he had erased physical evidence, she would have to find proof elsewhere, in patterns, in inconsistencies, in the indirect traces left behind by someone meticulous but not infallible. Meanwhile, Julian was not idle. With the same ease he had used to manipulate his family, he wove a new identity, presenting himself as a prosperous, sophisticated man of business. In a nearby city, he sought out wealthy clients, projecting charisma, competence, and trustworthiness. One target, a woman named Vanessa Caldwell, was particularly receptive. She was affluent, independent, and cautious by nature, but Julian's charm, his apparent expertise in investment, and the aura of credibility he exuded melted her defenses. "I have a project," Julian told her one evening over candlelit drinks in a high-end restaurant, his voice smooth and measured. "It's innovative, low-risk, high-return. I've invested myself. But I need a partner I can trust." His eyes, dark and calculating, never wavered. I think you and I could accomplish something extraordinary. Vanessa, who had endured many disappointments in her own business dealings, found herself drawn to Julian's confidence. She asked questions, scrutinized financials, but every answer he gave was precise, reassuring, compelling. He had thought of every objection, preemptively crafting narratives that soothed doubts before they fully emerged. Within weeks, Vanessa had invested a substantial sum, convinced she was partnering with a man of integrity, unaware that she had stepped into a trap as carefully constructed as any Julian had ever set. Clara, meanwhile, continued to pursue the threads of Julian's past. Late nights turned into early mornings as she cross-referenced financial records, pharmacy logs, and personal correspondences. Each discovery amplified the gravity of the situation. Julian had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the motive to exploit those around him. Every carefully orchestrated act in Eleanor's final months now seemed to be part of a larger pattern, a demonstration of his capacity to manipulate life and death with impunity. The stakes rose further when Clara discovered that Julian had already begun siphoning Vanessa's investment to pay off old debts, a pattern of deception that mirrored his earlier fraudulent enterprises. Money flowed out of Vanessa's accounts and into Julian's pockets with surgical precision, funding a lifestyle of luxury he did not earn. While Vanessa remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal, Clara's chest tightened with a mixture of horror and indignation. Julian was not just a manipulator. He was a predator, carefully selecting victims, orchestrating their trust, and exploiting it without remorse. Clara knew she could not confront him directly without protection. She reached out to Detective Harris, who had begun to take the case seriously after reviewing the growing evidence of Julian's fraud and potential involvement in Eleanor's death. Together, they planned a series of steps: tracking Julian's movements, securing forensic proof of the rare drug, and setting up a controlled environment to observe his interactions with Vanessa, hoping to catch him in the act of fraud or coercion. The psychological tension in Clara's life was relentless. Sleep became erratic. Every phone call, every unexpected knock, triggered spikes of anxiety. Even in the sanctuary of her own home, she felt Julian's presence, a shadow in the mind rather than in the room. She feared for Vanessa, feared that without intervention, Julian would ruin another life, and perhaps worse, that his pattern of manipulative behavior had extended even further than anyone realized. Clara's perseverance finally paid off when she traced a shipment of rare compounds that matched the pharmaceutical profile she had identified in Eleanor's case. Records, though cryptic and disguised, indicated that Julian had purchased the substances under an alias months before Eleanor's death. The pieces began to align into a coherent but horrifying narrative. Julian had methodically orchestrated the decline of Eleanor's health, masked by medical knowledge and charm, then moved on to financial manipulation and exploitation, repeating the cycle with meticulous planning. Confronted with this mounting evidence, Clara and Detective Harris devised a plan to catch Julian in the act with Vanessa's funds. Undercover financial audits, surveillance, and careful monitoring of his communications began to reveal the depth of his deception. Each observation was a piece of the puzzle, each transaction a thread leading to the full tapestry of Julian's crimes. The tension reached a breaking point when Clara attended a social gathering where Julian had been invited to meet potential investors, including Vanessa. She watched from a distance, noting every gesture, every word, every calculated smile. Julian moved through the crowd with a predator's precision, charming, disarming, and always in control. But Clara, equipped with evidence and the resolve born from months of sleepless nights and obsessive investigation, felt for the first time a sense of impending justice. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Julian, unaware that every move was being documented, began weaving the narrative of a lifetime. The affluent widow entrusting him with funds, the secure return promised, the illusion of mutual benefit. Clara and Detective Harris moved like shadows, prepared to strike the moment Julian's deception became undeniable. The stage was set, tension electric, the years of manipulation and murder finally about to meet the reckoning they deserved. And in that moment, Clara realized the full truth. Julian's brilliance was terrifying, but it was bounded by human error. Every carefully constructed lie, Every calculated step had left a trace. Every act of cruelty, no matter how subtle, had built the path for his eventual downfall. The question was no longer if he would be stopped, it was how, and whether anyone could endure witnessing the full extent of his crimes. The discovery of the journal was the culmination of months of tireless investigation, sleepless nights, and the gnawing anxiety that Clara had carried in her chest since the day her beloved grandmother Eleanor had died. It was a leather-bound notebook, unassuming in its appearance. Yet within its pages lay a meticulously detailed account of Julian Vance's life of deception, manipulation, and murder. Each entry was a careful record. The names of his victims, the dates of each encounter, the methods of persuasion he employed, the financial schemes he had orchestrated, and even the subtle psychological manipulations he had used to maintain control over his targets. Clara's hands trembled as she leafed through the pages, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Julian had not been reckless. He had not acted on impulse. Every lie, every act of betrayal had been deliberate, calculated, and methodical. The man she had once considered a trusted relative, a figure of warmth and familiarity, was a predator who had built his life around exploiting trust, sowing fear, and inflicting suffering. Her first call was to Detective Harris, the officer who had grown to understand the depths of Julian's manipulation over the past several months. She explained the significance of the journal, enumerating the details it contained. How Julian had falsified medical prescriptions to weaken Eleanor, how he had drained her accounts under the guise of financial advice, and how he had constructed an elaborate network of deceit to shield himself from suspicion. Harris, listening intently, felt a chill creep up his spine. This was not simply fraud. This was premeditated, methodical criminal behavior stretching over years. Armed with this new evidence, the police began to coordinate their approach. Surveillance teams were deployed, search warrants were secured, and investigators meticulously cataloged every page of the journal as evidence. The careful handwriting of Julian, his almost obsessive habit of documenting every detail, became the key to unraveling the scope of his crimes. Each entry was cross-referenced with financial records, communications, and witness statements, building a mountain of irrefutable proof. When Julian was finally confronted, the moment was electric with tension. Clara had insisted on being present at the police station, her heart hammering in her chest as she waited to see the man who had destroyed so many lives. Julian was escorted into the interrogation room with a sense of shock and disbelief etched across his face. For the first time, he was not in control. There were no charming words, no rehearsed smile, no calculated gestures to mask his true intentions. The predator, so long confident in his ability to manipulate, was suddenly vulnerable. Detective Harris began the questioning, his voice calm but unyielding. He presented the evidence: the detailed journal, the financial frauds, the falsified prescriptions, the accounts of psychological manipulation, and the corroborated testimonies of those Julian had deceived. At first, Julian tried to maintain a veneer of innocence, his tone measured, his words carefully chosen. "You have no proof," he insisted, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a flaw, a weakness, any sign of mercy. But the evidence was overwhelming. Each claim he made was countered with documented records, corroborated statements, and undeniable facts. The room seemed to shrink around him as the weight of his crimes bore down. Every detail he had so meticulously recorded in his journal now served as a testament to his guilt. The man who had believed himself untouchable began to falter, stammering under the relentless pressure of truth. Clara watched silently, a mixture of fear, anger, and vindication coursing through her veins. She remembered her grandmother's gentle voice, the warmth of her presence, and the betrayal that had shattered her family. Seeing Julian exposed in this way was cathartic, yet the horror of his actions lingered like a shadow over the room. She felt a strange combination of sorrow for the victims and grim satisfaction at the realization that justice was finally within reach. The arrest itself was swift. Julian was taken into custody, handcuffed, and read his rights. He did not resist physically, but the subtle arrogance in his posture, the calm superiority that had defined him for so long, began to crumble with each step toward the squad car. The streets outside the station were quiet, but inside, the culmination of months of fear, anxiety, and painstaking investigation had reached its apex. Julian's fall from the illusion of control was complete. The trial that followed captured national attention. Media outlets chronicled every detail, from the revelation of Eleanor's death as a murder disguised as natural causes, to the financial scams, to the chilling psychological manipulation Julian had inflicted on countless individuals. Expert witnesses detailed the methodical nature of his crimes, explaining how he had created an elaborate web of deceit, preying on trust and exploiting relationships to achieve his ends. Clara testified before the court, her voice steady but full of emotion. She recounted the discovery of the journal, the subtle inconsistencies she had noticed, and the painstaking research that had led to Julian's exposure. Her words painted a portrait of a man whose crimes were as calculated as they were horrific, a figure whose charm had masked a deep and dangerous malice. Julian, for all his cunning, could not withstand the weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict that was both decisive and cathartic. Guilty on multiple counts, including murder, fraud, and abuse of trust. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole, a formal recognition of the magnitude of his crimes and the danger he posed to society. Even after the trial concluded, the impact of Julian's actions reverberated. Families attempted to heal, lives disrupted by his manipulations were slowly rebuilt, and Clara worked tirelessly to ensure that the lessons of this tragedy were not forgotten. The journal that had led to his capture was preserved as evidence, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked deceit and betrayal. In the quiet aftermath, Clara reflected on the fragility of trust, the vulnerability of human relationships, and the ease with which a single individual could exploit those bonds for personal gain. Julian Vance, once considered a trusted family member, had revealed the darkness that could exist behind the most familiar faces. The case became a cautionary tale, a story shared to warn others that evil is not always overt, and that vigilance, courage, and persistence are essential when confronting deception, even when it comes from those we hold closest. And so, justice was served, but the scars remain a permanent reminder that betrayal could be intimate, calculated, and devastating. Julian's reign of terror had ended, but the lessons learned from his crimes would echo for generations, ensuring that the lives he had sought to control would never be forgotten, and that the courage of a single determined granddaughter could triumph against a lifetime of calculated evil. The death of Eleanor Vance had left a void that could never truly be filled. Her presence had been the anchor of her familiar beacon of warmth, wisdom, and unconditional love. Now, in the cold silence left behind, her family struggled to navigate the labyrinth of grief and betrayal. Clara, perhaps more than anyone, felt the weight of this loss. The woman who had nurtured her, guided her, and provided a sense of safety had been taken from her not by chance or fate, but by the calculated malice of someone she had once trusted implicitly. Clara's journey through grief was not linear. There were mornings she awoke to an unbearable ache in her chest, nights when sleep was impossible, and moments when the world seemed irreparably cruel. Yet, in the midst of this anguish, Clara discovered a resilience she had never fully recognized in herself. She faced not only the sorrow of losing her grandmother but also the bitter sting of betrayal. Julian Vance, a man who had presented himself as family, had woven lies so intricately that it had taken months of investigation, intuition, and courage to expose him. The confrontation with his duplicity left Clara shaken to her core, but it also sparked a determination that would guide her forward. The unraveling of Julian's schemes was a process both painstaking and painstakingly precise. Police investigations, court proceedings, and the painstaking collection of evidence revealed the staggering breadth of his crimes. It became apparent that Julian had been living a double life for years. On the surface, a man of charm, civility, and familial devotion. Beneath it, a predator who exploited trust, manipulated emotions, and committed crimes both financial and moral. His carefully curated image as a respectable relative had been nothing more than a mask, concealing the predatory instincts and pathological deceit that defined him. When the trial began, the courtroom was thick with tension. Victims, family members, and observers alike bore witness to the full scope of Julian's offenses. The journal that Clara had discovered, once a silent testament to his deceit, became a central pillar of the prosecution's case. Every page, every entry, every meticulously chronicled lie was laid bare before the court. Clara's testimony, delivered with a combination of calm authority and palpable emotion, recounted the painstaking path that had led to his exposure. She spoke of her grandmother's final days, of the suspicions that had kept her awake at night, and of the painstaking research that ultimately uncovered the truth. Julian, for all his cunning, appeared diminished in the courtroom. The arrogance that had allowed him to manipulate so many began to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. Witness after witness described how they had been deceived, exploited, and harmed, each account punctuating the sheer audacity and cold calculation of his actions. The juxtaposition of his outward charm and the depth of his crimes left the jury and the public alike horrified. This was not a man driven by impulsive greed or sudden rage. This was a man who had systematically, methodically, and ruthlessly violated the trust of those closest to him. As the verdict was delivered guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, abuse, and complicity in Eleanor's death, the courtroom exhaled a collective breath that had been held for months. Julian Vance was sentenced to life imprisonment, a legal acknowledgement of both the severity and premeditated nature of his crimes. Justice had been served, yet Clara understood that the real reckoning was far more complex. The emotional aftermath, the shattered trust, and the scars left upon her family and the victims could not be remedied by any sentence. In the days and months that followed, Clara worked tirelessly to support those affected, to rebuild the shattered networks of trust, and to honor the memory of Eleanor. She became a source of guidance for other families, helping them navigate the treacherous waters of betrayal, loss, and recovery. Her experiences crystallized a vital truth. Deception and malice often hide behind familiar faces, and vigilance, courage, and critical thought are essential weapons in confronting them. Clara also found strength in reflection. The story of Julian Vance became more than a cautionary tale, it became a lesson in the human condition. Trust, once broken, could be repaired only through patience, transparency, and relentless pursuit of truth. The pain inflicted by Julian was immeasurable, yet it had revealed the strength of those who had refused to remain passive, who had dared to uncover and confront evil even when it lurked within the sanctuary of family. The Vance household, once shadowed by the terror of betrayal, slowly began to find equilibrium. Eleanor's legacy endured, not only through the memories of her kindness and generosity, but also in the lessons imparted by her tragic end. The family's experience became a testament to resilience, a narrative demonstrating that while evil can hide in plain sight, it can be exposed, challenged, and ultimately defeated. Julian's downfall reverberated beyond the immediate circle of victims. The case captured national attention, sparking discussions about trust, familial obligations, and the insidious nature of manipulation. Psychologists, law enforcement officials, and ethicists analyzed the case, dissecting Julian's methods, his psychological profile, and the vulnerabilities that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. For many, the story of Eleanor and Clara Vance became a framework for understanding the subtle, pervasive, and often invisible ways in which betrayal can infiltrate the most intimate of relationships. In the end, the truth prevailed. Julian's life of deceit and harm was brought to light, his freedom removed, and his capacity to inflict further damage curtailed. Yet, the lasting impact of his actions served as a somber reminder. Evil does not always announce itself with fanfare or violence. It can dwell quietly in the corners of familiarity, thriving in secrecy until courage, diligence, and the pursuit of justice expose it. For Clara, the journey was transformative. She emerged from the ordeal not only as a survivor but as a guardian of truth and a witness to the resilience of the human spirit. The lessons she learned about vigilance, courage, and the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths would guide her for the rest of her life. And though the memory of Eleanor's death and Julian's betrayal would always cast a shadow, it was tempered by the knowledge that justice had been pursued, that the truth had been revealed, and that even the darkest deception could ultimately be brought into the light. Thus, the saga of Julian Vance became more than a story of crime. It became a testament to the enduring power of truth, the resilience of those who refused to be silenced, and the unyielding pursuit of justice in the face of the most intimate betrayals. The world had witnessed the fall of a man who had hidden behind trust, and in doing so, it had gained a profound understanding of the fragile yet indomitable nature of integrity, courage, and moral vigilance.